in a lot of ways, joining an intentional community is sort of a self-selecting process. The people that want to join are going to be the ones that are most appropriate. If somebody doesn't want that kind of arrangement, this and this, I really am not interested in that.
Welcome to the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast, the show where you learn how to plan, build, and live the tiny lifestyle. I'm your host, Ethan Waldman, and this is episode 214 with Mike Moore. Today, you'll get the inside scoop on what it's like to live in and to be a founding member of an intentional community. We cover everything from how to come up with the money to buy the land, how to come up with the rules, how to choose new members, and more. My guest, Mike Moore, has lived in community for over 25 years, and he lived in a ground-bound tiny house designed by the one and only Jay Shafer. I hope you stick around. I want to tell you about something that I think will be super helpful as you plan, design, and build your tiny house. Tiny House Decisions is the guide that I wish I had when I was building my tiny house. It comes in 3 different packages to help you on your unique tiny house journey. And if you're struggling to just figure out the systems for your tiny house, like how you're going to heat it, how you're going to plumb it, what construction technique are you going to use, like SIPs or stick framing or steel framing, Tiny House Decisions will take you through all these processes systematically and help you come up with a design that works for you. Right now, I'm offering 20% off any package of Tiny House Decisions. For listeners of the show, you can head over to thetinyhouse.net/THD to learn more and use the coupon code TINY at checkout for 20% off any package. Again, that's thetinyhouse.net/THD and use the coupon code TINY for 20% off. All right, I am here with Mike Moore. Mike is one of the earlier proponents of the modern tiny house movement. He built his first tiny house on a foundation in 2005, designed by Jay Shafer. This was located at Potluck Farm, an intentional community of 13 families on 170 acres in Rougemont, North Carolina. In 2017, he moved into his second tiny just next door at Elderberry co-housing. Elderberry consists of 18 households on 11 acres and was designed for those 50 and up. Mike brings over 25 years of experience with intentional communities and tiny house living to the discussion. Mike Moore, welcome to the show.
Hey, Ethan.
I'm glad to have you here. Excited to talk all about intentional communities and co-housing. So I guess let's start with Potluck Farm. Can you tell us more about what Potluck Farm is, maybe how it got its start?
Sure. It started about 4 or 5 families in the late 80s, all friends and coworkers who would get together about once a month just to have potlucks. They also did a week at the beach at Thanksgiving every year. And they would just sit around and, of course, and talking about, well, we should buy some land. And at around 1990, I believe, they quit talking and did it and bought about 120 acres, pulled their money and bought that piece of land. It has since grown to 170 acres and is now 13 families. And it's been going for over 30 some years, also still going to the beach every year. So legend has it that the start of it was born in a hot tub, but I don't have any idea if that's really true or not. They changed people over the years here and there, but some of the original folks are still there. I came along in about 1987 or 88, possibly. That was back in my married days, and we bought one of the 3-acre lots and first put a manufactured home, a trailer on there for a couple years, and then built a conventional home of about 1,800 square feet or so, finished. And then we split in 2004, and that's more, I had to leave the community for a short period of time, but they wanted me back, and so that's when I built my first tiny.
That must be difficult, and that's something that a community has to deal with when a marriage breaks up or people break up, how how is it decided who gets to stay and who gets to leave, or do both people stay?
Well, it usually is, at least in my case, and I'm certainly not the only one that went through this experience there. I can get into that a little bit, but it was an amicable type situation. So my wife got the house, and a little further background. There's at least, I think, three couples over the years that have split up, and there was one home, sort of an extra home on the land that we used as sort of a community building that became sort of like the lost boys home, so that anybody who was going out of a relationship usually stayed there for a few months before they found something new to go to. But most of the splits that I can think of were amicable, and so it just worked out as it would in everyday life.
That's good to hear that it's amicable. And I think something that appeals to a lot of people but also scares a lot of people about intentional communities is that kind of needing to get along with and work with all of your neighbors and come to agreements. I've heard that there are a lot of meetings.
Yeah, if you're not a meeting fan, it can be a little difficult. Of course, over the years, you get better at meetings. With 30 years of experience at Potluck, they've gotten pretty good at meetings. They're monthly meetings. Usually, they do a fun meeting one month, and then the
Uh-huh.
next month might be business. And of course, at the start of any community, there's going to be a lot of meetings, and all those are business.
Okay.
So,
Right. All of those meetings are business. I'm curious, it sounds like you weren't around for the start of Potluck, but that you have been a part of the founding of Elderberry.
right.
Is that correct?
That's correct. What the way that Potluck evolved was, I had a cleaning business, and I cleaned the homes of several of those members of Potluck, before the actual, building of homes out at the property began. And so I would always see the notices for the potlucks and the meetings, and I'd say, "Well, what's this all about?" And so that's how sort of I got into Potluck.
Mm-hmm.
Elderberry was started in about 2007,
Oh, okay.
and I was part of that at that point.
Interesting. Okay. And can you talk about some of the differences between Elderberry and Potluck?
Yeah, there's a lot of differences
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of similarities because, of course, some of the original founders of Elderberry came from Potluck.
Mm-hmm.
But first of all, is we are not intergenerational at Elderberry.
Okay.
We're all 50 and up, so it became a place where the kids have grown and gone,
Okay.
and we wanted less to take care of and smaller spaces. But there are a lot of really probably more similarities. I mean, we share some equipment and we share some land with them. We share a community building with them.
Mm-hmm.
All kinds of resources like paths and ponds and orchards and stuff are shared. So there's probably more in common than not. Plus the fact that we're only probably, my guess is about 200 yards away, so from each other. So it's more like sister communities than adversarial.
Adversarial. You have a community to play when you all want to like play baseball against one another. It's the two
That's
teams.
true. Al- Although it's funny, I don't know how many of us are into the sports thing. Uh, we do occasionally get a member that's into like March Madness or something, and then we don't know what to do with them. But but we're more on the order of croquet and shuffleboard.
Yep. I'm more of a music guy myself. And so tell us about the tiny house that you had designed by Jay Shafer.
Well, when I was had left Potluck, I was gone about a year, and the members of Potluck wanted me back, and I wanted to be back, but there basically were no lots left.
Okay.
There was quite a bit of land. There's about 100 acres that we don't use, In fact, most of it's in a land conservancy at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But there was one 3-acre spot. It was a very odd shaped lot, very narrow.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I'd been looking at the tiny house stuff for some time. And
Okay.
so we worked out a deal where I just, instead of buying that lot, I leased it
Okay.
on a long-term lease and for very little amount of money. And then I went ahead with my plans with Jay, and he drew up. It was actually one of his homes that was about, um, for him at that time, was sort of large. It was like 100.
Okay.
I think it was 10 by 12. Most of his were at that point were under 100. But I asked him to scale it up for me a little bit, and so it grew eventually to about, I think, 16 by 22. So around 350 was the footprint, and then there was a loft.
Okay.
So, and went ahead and had no problems with planning and zoning in the rural county I'm in, so that worked out.
And this was a stationary, a foundation built house.
Yeah, I've always been more attracted to the permanent location type stuff than the on wheels.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I continually have to, with all the groups I belong to, continually have to sort of fight for that position because most people want to go towards something that's movable.
Yeah. What was the regulatory journey like in setting up Elderberry?
In setting up Elderberry, that was interesting. This is a mostly rural county. I think the county seat has about a town of 10,000 people.
Okay.
So that was in 2007 or 8, and with the aging
Mm-hmm.
population of not just that county but everywhere, they were sort of looking for some process, not process, but some kind of accommodations for their aging population. And we came along and said, well, we've got a great idea. And so we worked with them to create what's called
Mm-hmm.
a cluster zone. And it was a whole new concept for them and us. And it basically, what they wanted to do was
Okay.
they don't want a lot of that rural land disturbed, and we wanted to pull everything closer together anyway. So it we have quite a bit of our 10 acres is devoted to not only septic and wells, but gardens and stuff that sort of keeps things intact, and the houses take up very little of that. So it worked out that we could just work together with the county and come up with something.
Right. So you that's great that it sounds like you found kind of mutually beneficial, or just the county was interested in not
Hmm.
using all the land, and you were interested in building the community, and so you
Hmm.
could come up with kind of a special zone to make that happen.
Several people here who are quite skilled at working with those kind of political entities that helped a lot. Several people, I don't know how to describe it actually. We've got people who work in HR type stuff and just are very good at those interpersonal skills to get that done.
So we've got some great questions from Tiny House Engage, which is an online community that I run.
Hmm.
Um, and so the first question is, in regards to intentional communities, do you think there should be an interview and voting process for prospective residents and their dogs?
I don't think we ever considered the animal interviews. There is a process that we have devised to get to know members or prospective members.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of ways, joining an intentional community is sort of a self-selecting process. The people that want to join are going to be
Mm-hmm.
the ones that are most appropriate. If somebody doesn't want that kind of arrangement, they're going to come out and look and say, "Oh, you do this and this. I really am not interested in that." So
Mm-hmm.
the way we framed it over at Potluck, we had one resident who's a single woman, and the question we always posed in our conversations was,
Mm-hmm.
well, what about Marge's boyfriend? If Marge decides to pick up somebody from some bar in Durham and he wants to live out here, and he's got. Um, we came up with this fictional boyfriend that was just a terrible person. He never showed up, so I guess we were okay. But yeah, and there is Elderberry slightly different. It's probably a little bit more formal than that, but there's several like
Hmm.
meetings that people come to before they are accepted as members, and events, and they come to maybe a couple work days or something like that, and then we get together and see if it's going to work out. But it's informal, but there's still a selection process.
Yeah. Of the people who, I guess, apply, they're not applying, but of the people who express interest, what percentage would you say, gets accepted?
Um, I'd say probably 80 to 90%. It's pretty obvious early on if it's a good match or not. If somebody comes out here and finds out that after a business meeting that they just can't deal with consensus and that whole process of making decisions, which is can sometimes be quite lengthy and involved and tortuous at times,
Hmm.
they'll
Hmm.
say, "Well, you know what? Maybe this isn't for me." But I'd say most of them get through the process fairly well, and there is a number of people who, once they join and even maybe buy a house here,
Hmm.
maybe a year down the line, they find out there's something about it that just isn't for them, and they'll move on. That's just like anywhere else.
Yeah. And so then if they buy a house in the community, how does it work? How does that work if they decide to move on?
We sell. We don't deal with a
Hmm.
realtor. We do for various reasons. We are the sort of the
Okay.
realtor ourselves. So they save that money on the realtor commission. We also created something called a legacy clause, and I think this is it may not be unique to our situation, but I don't know of many co-housing groups that do this. When somebody sells their home, they keep, of course, most of the proceeds, but of the profit that they make on the home, they keep 25%, and Elderberry keeps 75%.
Oh, okay.
There's a number of reasons we do that, but the one mostly is that we're trying to keep the cost of houses down for the new buyers, and encourage. It's I wouldn't call us affordable housing necessarily. We do sell a little bit less than the going rate, but these days that's still unaffordable for a lot of people,
Hmm.
especially those just starting out.
Yeah, that's really smart, and that's an interesting way to do it.
Yeah, it helps the financial viability of our community that we can, we have money now saved for, things we need. And if there came a time when some people needed some money or for whatever reason, we can figure out how to do that a little bit easier. So we're very financially stable that way.
I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Tiny House Decisions, my signature guide, and the resource that I wish I had when I was building my tiny house. It starts with the big decisions, which is, should you build a tiny house yourself or with help? Is a pre-built shell a good idea? Is a house on wheels better than on the ground, and what works better for you? Deciding on the overall size, deciding on whether you should use custom plans or pre-made plans, different types of trailers, and more. Then in part 2, we get into the systems. So heat, water, showers, hot water, toilets, electrical, refrigeration, ventilation. And we're only 2/3 of the way through the book at this point. From systems, we go into construction decisions, talking about nails versus screws, SIPs versus stick framed versus advanced framing versus metal framing. We talk about how to construct a subfloor, sheathing, roofing materials, insulation, windows, flooring, kitchen. I know I'm just reading off the table of contents, but I just want to give you a sense of how comprehensive Tiny House Decisions is. It's a total of 170 pages. It contains tons of full color drawings, diagrams, and resources. and it really is the guide that I wish I had when I was building my tiny house. Right now, I'm offering 20% off any package of tiny house decisions using the coupon code TINY when you head over to thetinyhouse.net/THD. That's THD for tiny house decisions. Again, that's coupon code TINY when you check out at thetinyhouse.net/THD. Do you have like fixed monthly membership dues?
Yes, we do. We have monthly assessments.
Mm-hmm.
The potluck assessments were quarterly. They're fairly
Mm-hmm.
low, but for here at Elderberry, their monthly assessment, which right now is a little over $200.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a big operation. We have a common house that we got to maintain. We have all our land and stuff and equipment that needs to be maintained. So, and in 10, 20 years down the road, when things start to wear out, we have to have money for replacing that. So those assessments go toward all maintenance of all the land and possessions that we've got.
Got it. And then the land itself, is that owned outright by Elderberry essentially?
There's some of it that is Elderberry community owned, and I haven't done the math on this lately. And then the lot that your house sits on is owned by the
Mm-hmm.
property owner. That's an individual or a couple or whatever. But the lots are not very big. We own the Elderberry proper site is, I think, 11 acres, and
Mm-hmm.
there's 18 homes on that 11 acres. And so, but the lots are only 24 by 80. So that's fairly small. So it'd be possible to do the math, but I don't want to really do that. but there's at least 6 or 8 acres of that was communally owned.
Yeah. So with the lots being smaller, are many of the houses small or tiny houses?
They range. Mine's the smallest, and is what what some people would call the only true tiny house.
Mm-hmm.
We have several at around 700, 800, 900. The
Mm-hmm.
largest of the 18 is there are a few that are around 1,200.
Okay. So
So it's much
small but
smaller
not
than
tiny.
the average American home. Right.
Got it. Got it. So this is another question from our community online here is how does Elderberry handle conflict between residents and or residents who don't step up and work to maintain the community?
That's a rough one or a tough one for almost all co-housing communities.
Mm-hmm.
For conflict, we have actually a formal process. Some some communities allow in the consensus process allow blocking, where if one person
Okay.
doesn't want to do something or does want to do something and the rest don't, then that sort of stops everything. We don't quite go that far. We don't allow blocking, but we do have a mediation process that we go through with people that's contained within the community. If that doesn't work, then there could be a more formal type of mediation process.
Okay.
But essentially, it comes down to if the whole community decides that something, after we've been through all the mediation processes, that something is still should be done for the best of the community, then we'll go ahead with it.
That's good.
But I don't think that we've really had to do that
Yeah.
ever.
Hopefully.
Conflicts arise. That's just life, and so you figure out hopefully adult ways of dealing with it.
Yep.
Oh, you mentioned. I want to go back to one thing. You said that about the work. That is tough because you've got a couple of thought processes going on there.
Mm-hmm.
One is the whole idea of fairness and what's equal or what's right. You got a lot of right and wrong revolving around that one. And we haven't. Some communities will have
Mm-hmm.
an actual work log where they'll determine hours, and if you don't work a certain number of hours, you do certain things. We don't have that. We're a little more laid back than that. there are so many ways that people can contribute to a community that the ones that are most visible, of course, are the ones that everybody sees every day when people are out working in the garden or they're out constructing something or working on the land. But the ones behind the scenes that are hard to see are a little more
Yeah.
difficult to follow. And that's things like taking care of the books or, stuff, just a lot of behind the scenes stuff that people don't see. And so when people think that somebody isn't contributing, they may be. It might be something that you don't see. And people's level of contribution can change in an acute way or in a long-term way. For example, if they're compromised
Yeah.
by some kind of health situation or a family situation where that week they can't do something or that year they can't do something, you have to take all those things into account.
So I think it was in an interview. You mentioned that there are too many traditional tiny house tours out there. Um, what what have you what have you not seen tours of yet that you would like to see?
Oh, geez. Well, in the early days, I probably looked at everything that was available
Hmm.
because there just wasn't that much
Yeah,
available.
that makes sense.
I'd love to see, of course, I'm prejudiced, but I'd love to see more homes on foundations, I suppose.
Yeah,
I'm probably most tired of the van conversions. I think there's a lot of that stuff after a while that just sort of blends together for me, but I certainly would like to see more of the
hmm,
houses on foundation.
yeah,
Maybe some more alternative building methods rather than stick built. But I really can't complain too much. I mean,
yeah,
I went through so many years where there was no information out there, and now there's like almost too much. So I guess that's just the hazard of it becoming mainstream, or at least a little more mainstream than it used to be.
yeah. It's definitely become very much more mainstream. With the fact that Elderberry is a community for folks who are 50 and up, what kind of accommodations are made for ADA requirements or just other features that make it easier for folks to age in place there?
The first thing we did was make, with one or two exceptions, we made all the houses ground level accessible.
Hmm.
We did have a few requirements around universal design, not many, and a number of guidelines for that. The One of the requirements, besides the ground level access, was wider doorways, 3-foot doorways. If you can't see the door behind me too well, but that's the door to my bathroom, and it's a 36
Okay.
inch wide door. But there were several that weren't necessarily required, but they were strongly suggested. One, for example, is I don't think we have a requirement for grab bars and stuff in the
Hmm.
bathroom, but we do have one that the blocking for to support those types of things
Okay.
be in the walls. So in case somebody would need it, they wouldn't have to tear out a wall. They just put up a grab bar. It just so happened that I decided to work in quite a few universal design things in my house that some of the other houses do not. One of the things was One of the things we did require was a 5-foot turning circle in the bathroom.
Yep.
So if there's a wheelchair in there, you could actually turn it around and get out. Besides that, I went ahead and put in, I think there are about 8 or 9 grab bars in my bathroom because for a tiny house, I have a huge bathroom. And so I have a separate tower and or shower and tub. They both have the bars. There's a bars by the toilet. There's access under the sink for a wheelchair. So I tried to do that throughout the house And universal design is a little bit different than accessible design, but I did a lot of that in my house. Besides the bathroom, I only have one other room.
Okay.
It's a sort of a multi-purpose room, and there's a Murphy bed. But even with the Murphy bed down, I could actually get a wheelchair in this part of the house, the major room, and move around okay, and have access to that bed.
That's fantastic.
So it was just something personally I wanted to do. I don't think everybody else has gone that far, and I don't need any of it yet. But there may come a time when I
Right.
do. So
And it'll be a lot easier if you do need it with the design decisions you've made.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. I'm curious. Kind of want to ask you the same question in two different ways, or I guess it's two different questions. The first would be, what advice would you have to somebody who's interested in living in an intentional community or co-housing when they're evaluating a community? You know, what kinds of things would you tell them to kind of pay attention to?
I think the first thing they need to pay attention to is personal.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do they want? You know, if we're mostly a rural community, and if something you like is a grocery store that's 2 minutes away, then this community isn't for you. But there's all kinds of different communities. In fact, this area of North Carolina is sort of a hotbed for co-housing. We've got at least 6 or 8 or 10 co-housing units in the Durham, Raleigh area.
Wow.
I think we may be one of the few that's this rural, but if you want the benefits of being close to and part of a city that you can attend lots of concerts and walk around and downtown and hit all the restaurants and not have to drive a half an hour to get there, then you would be looking for something of that kind.
Right.
Other things might be you want a community with kids. You want an intergenerational community. So you have to sort of take stock of what you want and see what matches up with that.
And then the other side of my question is, for somebody who's maybe interested in starting an intentional community or co-housing community, what advice do you have for them?
Ooh, well, I'm torn. I think if people knew all the work that would go into making a co-housing community, most of them would probably not get started. You have to be clear about how you're going to finance it, of course.
Yeah.
The joy of working in a group is that a lot more things are possible than working on your own. If for example, you wanted to buy a lot somewhere and put up a tiny house, you might have trouble doing that financially. But if you've got a group of people, some of whom have more money than others, which is going to be inevitable, then there might be ways that you can work out arrangements where those who have more resources can help those who don't. But it's extremely hard work, and the work doesn't stop just because you build a community and are living in a community. The building goes on emotionally and physically forever.
Right.
It's just that's the part of working with people, you know. And it's not for everybody. You know, some people don't want that, and that's fine. You know, if they, I don't know. I tend to lean away from that whole concept of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps and do it on your own. And, you know, that's fine if somebody doesn't want to live 10 feet away from somebody.
Yeah.
But we all need help occasionally, and you got to have your support systems somehow. So whether it's family or church or nature or whatever, you got to have that support system. I've held many jobs over the years, and I've never been in any job that was a big money maker. So I could not have normally have joined a group like this because I couldn't afford it. But and banks aren't necessarily going to just give you the money you need.
Yeah.
So you have to work around those issues. And so I found people that were, believed in me and were willing to loan me money. But,
Nice. That's wonderful. And that's something that you can't necessarily get from a bank.
yeah.
You need a community. You need the people.
No.
Yeah.
Not usually. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, one thing that I like to ask, all of my guests is, are there any resources that have inspired you or helped you in learning about co-housing or intentional communities that you can share with our listeners?
There's probably all kinds of books out there,
mm-hmm.
of which I know very few. The people that started co-housing
mm-hmm.
in this country have Durant and McCormick have a few books out.
Okay.
That are helpful, but mostly I would say, since it's sort of a people-based type philosophy, it's just finding your tribe.
Yeah.
So I see a lot of people who want to start tiny house communities, but I think it's fairly difficult, or even more difficult, to start one where that's the only your only focus. It's not just a house that you're dealing with. You're dealing with people.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of hard work. As far as tiny houses themselves, there are plenty of resources out there. Some ones for me were certainly Lloyd Kahn of Shelter Publications,
mm-hmm.
Lester Walker's book of tiny houses.
Yep.
And then, of course, in the modern movement, Jay and some of the early folks in that, D. Williams, Jay's first customer,
Yeah.
and then a few years later after that, there were people that picked it up as far as the social media and started doing blogs, like Kent
mm-hmm.
Griswold and Michael Jansen and Ryan Mitchell.
Mm-hmm.
Macy Miller is another one that I liked a lot. Her stuff.
Great.
So.
Well, Mike Moore, thank you so much for being a guest on the show today. I really enjoyed this.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much to my guest, Mike Moore, for being a guest on the show today. You can find the show notes, including a complete transcript and more, over at thetinyhouse.net/214. Again, that's thetinyhouse.net/214. That is all for this week. I'm your host, Ethan Waldman, and I'll be back next week with another episode of the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast.